Hello, everybody, and welcome. Are we now live? Okay, I hear we're now live, so welcome everybody to this session, and thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday for many of us. I'm aware of at least one of our panelists who's actually awake at 3 in the morning to attend this session, so we're very grateful to him and to all of you for joining us today. So this session is a skills building session, which will be going on for the next 3 hours. And as you'll see from the title of the session, which I hope will soon come up, it's on managing global health research collaborations. I'll introduce myself. I'm going to be the moderator for this session. I'm actually employed by the University of Oxford, but have been based until very recently in Kenya, working for the Kenyan Medical Research Institute Wellcome Trust Research Programme as a health systems researcher and a researcher working in research ethics. And I've had the privilege in working in many different research collaborations over my 30-odd years of research. Next session, please, or next slide, please. In this session, we'll be bringing together speakers who have a huge amount of expertise and experience in health research collaborations. It's a real honor to have all of these people contributing in different ways to this session. What we thought we would do is, rather than introduce everybody at this stage of the session, we'll introduce them as they begin their contributions or presentations. So I'll introduce you to them throughout the next session. But next slide, please, just to give you a reminder of the aims of this session. Many of you will be aware that managing research collaborations is incredibly complex, involving many different challenges, not least of which is aligning very diverse interests in terms of having many different actors, many different institutions, often different disciplines, working across different sectors. So managing that is complex. It brings many challenges, and building and maintaining relationships that are essential to those collaborations is a core concern. So what we wanted to do in this session was to bring people together to discuss their experiences and to share resources and top tips on managing collaborations. So we were hoping that we together will build our skills to build strategies that help us resolve the managerial challenges that we encounter and to negotiate these multiple dimensions that make up collaboration management. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of what the session will look like, we'll begin with Nadia Tagoi talking about collaboration management, giving us an overview. We'll then hear from 3 people who have been leaders in many different research consortia about their experiences. While these people are presenting to us, we'd really appreciate it if all of you who have joined us today could be feeding in your own experiences and questions for these presenters into your live Q&A box. In the next slide, I'll just tell you a little bit more about how to do that. But Sam Kinyanjui, who will run a Q&A session at the end of those presentations, will draw on your questions and on your inputs to bring those into the discussion and to share them with others. We'll then have a break for 10 minutes and then come back for a panel discussion where we'll do some more in-depth engagement around some of the experiences that have been shared, and we'll dig a little deeper into some of the practical details, practical strategies and ideas about how to manage collaborations. And then we'll finish off with a wrap-up by me. So just some tips on using the platform. If any of you need any support for technical issues, if you look up at the right-hand side of your screen, there's a button for live support. You should be able to click on that and get live support. Further down your screen, there's a label live Q&A. that's the place where you could type in your questions and your inputs, as I've just described earlier. And we're really keen to hear from you all and to be able to bring those ideas and resources to the session. So please do use that. We're told that for the best experience for everybody, please view the sessions in full screen. The sessions will be recorded and available for 14 days from tomorrow. And if you need to see the screen more clearly, apparently if you adjust your browser zoom ratio to 67% and play the session in full screen, that should give you the best viewing experience. Great. So just to get us going, and before Nadia gives us an overview, we just wanted to introduce a poll just to have a little sense of who's in the room, what kind of collaboration management experience that you all have. So I'll hand over to the technical team to organize that. Are we able to see the poll? Okay, so I understand that the poll will continue as we speak. So let me hand over to Nadia, who will give an overview of collaboration management. Nadia's a PhD fellow at the Can We Welcome Trust Research Programme. She has a background in international development and project management and is currently doing a PhD looking at the interaction between consortium management and capacity development. So over to you, Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sassy. Let me share my screen. Just a minute. Right, thank you. Thank you, Sassy, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to have all of you at this skills building session. What I aim to do with this brief talk is to lay the groundwork for the rest of the session, to give an overview of what collaboration management entails, and particularly some of the processes and principles involved. So there are very many definitions given to collaborations. I have selected this because of some of the elements that it brings out. So this defines collaboration as a mutually beneficial relationship between two or more individuals or organizations. And it puts an emphasis on having a common goal, as well as the need to share responsibility and authority and accountability in achieving those goals. And there are very many labels given to groups that are working together. For instance, you can have a consortium, a network, an alliance, and these terms are used interchangeably. Even though there's no widely accepted typology of what these terms represent, it's clear that there are very different levels of engagement from group to group. So that's what this diagram tries to portray here, which starts from the left, where you can see some fluid or loose relationships in working together, all the way to the right-hand side where you see the collaborations. For some of them, all they do perhaps is to exchange of information regarding what they are working on. Others share resources. But when you look at the extreme right, where you have collaborations, you see some of the elements I mentioned earlier on in terms of common goals, in terms of joint responsibility and mutual benefits. And it's essential to collaborate because health and our global development goals, for that matter, are complex, they are interlinked, and they require diverse perspectives and resources, and as well as shared learning to enable us achieve our collective goals. So what does collaboration management entail? There are a number of phases that I've laid out here with a number of processes within each of these phases, and I'll briefly give an overview of what each of these entail. I'll start with the first phase, which is the pre-inception phase. So this is the period before the collaboration is set up. And there are some elements or some considerations that need to be made during this period. For instance, context, the context that births the need for a collaboration. And for example, we have this COVID-19 pandemic, which acts as a context because it can bring up the need for collaborations. The institutions that actors within collaborations working forms a context as well. And there are very different motivations for establishing these collaborations. It can be because there's complementary capacity in different actors as well. So, and another thing also has to do with the history. There may be some history in terms of professional relationships or previous implementation of programs by some of these actors who are involved at this stage, who are thinking about establishing collaborations. And sometimes, particularly when it's a grant-funded collaboration, there may be prerequisites. So an example can be leadership, where it's required to have South-led leadership or North-led, or even the types of partners. So it has to be a North-South partnership. So these are some of the considerations that are made at this stage. And then the next stage is the inception stage, where the collaboration is actually established. So you have the purpose of the collaboration being refined at this stage, and then different considerations regarding how the collaboration is going to look like, which kind of partners are going to be involved, what are the partner selection criteria, and what kind of agreements would be required for such a collaboration. So those are also some of the considerations that are made at the inception stage. Then I have a planning and implementation stage where you have a lot more detailed planning happening. So for instance, the goals are refined here, the specific activities are detailed out, and who plays what roles are determined at this stage, and the basis for even making these decisions are fleshed out during this phase. How resources are allocated, what kind of governance structures, for instance, are used. Do you have an advisory level or a steering committee, as well as which type of management team actually coordinates the day-to-day activities of the collaboration. So that's where you have setups like a secretariat or roles like a director of the collaboration and program managers. And then there are also discussions regarding how the activities are going to be coordinated for the collaborations. Is it centralized? Is it going to be decentralized? And what form of monitoring mechanisms are going to be put in place to ensure that the goals are reached? So some collaborations often use periodic reporting, meetings, to monitor these activities. So these are some of the processes that go on during this phase. And it's important to point out at this stage that even though these phases that I'm laying out look quite discrete in the way I've presented them, in reality, the boundaries around them are quite blurred because you have activities bleeding across the various phases. So I can use the goals and activities as an example. Thinking around goals and activities starts as far back as the pre-inception stage. But then as the collaboration matures, as partners get on board, it's refined. As more information is made available, it's refined all the way up to this stage. So it's important to actually note that. And the last phase I'll talk about is closure or transition. So collaborations can move in different pathways at this stage. If it's set up specifically to implement a program and the decision is to close it out at the end of the implementation, then that's where you have closure. But sometimes collaborations transition into different stages. They can transition into one of the loser networks I talked about. So they may end up sharing information or resources going forward, or they can decide to access more funding and continue to operate at the collaborative level. But either way, collaborations need to evaluate their activities and if, especially when it's grant funded, to close out on their programs and finances. And more importantly, they have to, or they should, reflect and document and share some of the lessons learned, not just to improve their own future collaborations, but also share with the wider literature to benefit the wider space. So these are the four phases that I've just laid out. So I'm going to end my talk with this slide. which actually lists out some of the principles that have been found to be critical for collaborations. I've talked a bit about the need to have common goals. It's essential that there's clarity regarding each partner's interests and expectations. There's need for effective communication throughout all the different phases, and the processes should be transparent, particularly when it comes to decision-making within the collaborations. Mutual trust and respect among partners is also recommended. And it's also essential to include each partner throughout the processes and in all the activities, particularly when it comes to decision making. One of the key principles that's often raised has to do with equity. So equitable sharing of resources, benefits, and credit across the members of the collaboration, as well as sharing of power, responsibility and responsibility for the activities of the collaboration. So what this is meant to do is just to get us thinking about if and how we have experienced these principles in our collaborations and how they actually look like in practical terms. So I'm going to end here, and I'm going to encourage that discussions around some of the elements that I've raised carry on as the session goes on. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nadia, so much for that really helpful overview, and also with finishing off with those principles, which I guess the next presentations will help us think about how those can be operationalized and some of the experiences around operationalizing principles. Before I move on to ask Cara to speak next, just to mention that the poll is still ongoing and we've had 93 people vote so far. And it's really exciting to see that we have a nice mix of 47% of you who are here with us being involved in managing a collaboration. So I'm sure there'll be really rich experience that we can draw on and hope to incorporate in this session, as well as 40-odd%, and the votes are continuing to be placed. So 40-odd% of people who have been part of a collaboration, but not actually involved in the management. So really equally key contributions that can come from you all. And 12% of people who have not yet participated in a collaboration, but I would imagine are likely to at some point. So thanks very much, and do continue for the rest of you to add into that poll. So introducing now Cara Hansen, who will speak next. So Cara, as many of you will know, is a professor in health systems economics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she's the Dean of the Faculty of Public Health and Policy at the school. So Cara has a huge amount of experience in research collaborations. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you so much, Sassy, and thank you very much, Nadia and Sassy, for inviting me to be part of this session. I'll share my screen. I'm just going to have to check that that is the right slides. It should be. So, okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about RESYST, which was a research program consortium called an RPC that was funded by what was then the UK Department for International Development. You'll now know it as FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. And it ran from about 2010 to 2018. RESYST stood for Resilient and Responsive Health Systems. And so our the substance of our research was really about the elements that help to contribute to resilient health systems. And we kind of hypothesized at the beginning that that would require funding raised through progressive means and through a gradual transfer of responsibility and reliance to domestic over external resources, that there would be approaches to purchasing care and paying providers that would promote efficiency, and there'd be a set of institutional arrangements that would encourage individual and system learning in response to change. And that responsive health systems would require universal financial protection. Again, these systems for purchasing services and for producing and paying health workers frameworkers that support equitable healthcare delivery, and a set of institutional arrangements and governance arrangements that would support accountability among system actors. So this translated into a program that involved really 3 different objectives. So one was the need for high quality research. So we organized ourselves around 3 research themes, which were healthcare financing, the health workforce, and health system governance and management. And then we also were aiming to have influence on policies and on practices. And the third leg of our program was capacity development. We were really lucky to have an incredibly diverse and talented set of members from different countries in Africa and Asia, and those are listed here on the map. And what I'm going to do, really thinking about back to, I could talk for hours about the research itself, but because we want to talk here about managing collaborations, I thought I would hang this analysis of our collaboration really on this health system capacity framework that Lucy and her colleagues developed. And the core elements of the framework are, first of all, that you need systems hardware, money, people, infrastructure. You need tangible software, the kind of systems of management, the knowledge and skills and processes that support effective organizations, but also that you need intangible software, the relationships and the norms and the trust that helps people to interact effectively. And I'm going to argue here that actually it's the combination of the hardware, but in particular, the attention to the software that helps to create these intangible elements of the software that really supported an effective collaboration over many years. So a little bit about the hardware. So when Nadia was talking about the different stages of collaboration, I was thinking how incredibly fortunate we were to have a long period of time. So we had a year of an inception period, we had 5 years of research funding, and then a further 2-year extension. And actually, if you include the best part of the year beforehand that we spent developing the proposal, we worked together. I think I might need somebody to mute there. So we had actually 9 years of working together, and that was an incredibly useful period of time to be able to get to know each other and to develop those relationships. Time itself is both an advantage and a challenge. I'll come back to the end if I can. We had, in terms of hardware, we also had dedicated staff. So we had a London hub where we had a chief executive officer who was employed full-time on the program. We had a communications manager who was also, she might have been actually 80%, and we had a full-time project administrator. But also in each of the country members, there were dedicated staff, not all 100%, because research collaborators all had many different programs and projects they were involved with. But this was kind of a commitment up front to be able to ensure that people would have the funded time to contribute to the process. Another element of the hardware that was essential was our annual meeting. So every year we would get together usually for 4.5 days rotating through different members' locations. And this was a period of really intense activity and focus, but also a lot of fun that gave us the chances to get to know each other and to spend time together. In terms of the tangible software, one thing we had was structure. And I think that's really important, thinking about how you structure and organize your decision-making processes and your strategy development processes. So we had a management team that was focused in London with our chief executive officer, Lucy Gilson, and I as the research directors and our research uptake manager. We also had a management group that was really responsible for policy and strategy. And on this management group were representatives of each of the partners and also a lead of each of the research themes. We also had a consortium advisory group that met annually, but also provided some practical feedback and support during the course of each year. And then we had 3 key kind of groups organizing things. So we had a capacity development coordination group that was led by the CEO, but had membership of across the different members of the consortium. We had the research coordination group that reflected each of the research themes. And then we had the research uptake coordination group that was led by our research uptake manager. Another element of our tangible software, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about this, was our consortium satisfaction survey. So I think it's really important in the life of such collaborations to spend time reflecting on and attending to how it is that you work together. And so one of the mechanisms we had to do this was a survey that we administered to all our members each year. And then we would pick this up at the annual meeting, talk about the results, talk about what they meant and what was underlying the results, and then use that to adapt some of our consortium processes. So these are all very busy slides, and I'm not sure if you can see the questions here. But what we did was really to track over time the changes in some of these measures across different domains. So these are questions that were answered over a Likert scale. So for 1, not at all, through to 5, yes, very. And we had one survey domain that covered issues of transparency and voice. So asking about whether people knew what was going on at the consortium, if the updates were useful, if people felt connected with the consortium, if they had opportunities to raise points of concern within the consortium. And you can see that these measures kind of were gradually increasing over time. So they kind of increased, most of them, there was a few ebbs and flows, and mostly they were on an upward trajectory throughout. Another domain was consortium management itself. And the really interesting lines here are the blue and the purple ones at the bottom. And the blue one being about, so these were questions that were asked the other way around, but they had to be transposed to make sense of them. How undemanding is the level of financial reporting? So this was a requirement of our funder. So it reflected, it created an awful lot of work. And I think the low and slightly falling responses here reflected both the demands and the time involved in financial reporting, and more generally in the management tasks that were asked of members. There's a set of domains about about involvement in research. So, did the consortium enable people to engage with research? What sort of advice was possible? Whether it was helping people to produce high quality research. And here generally an upwards trajectory over time. And then a question about capacity development. So how helpful were the focus on activities for capacity development of individuals, of groups? And there were also questions about the wider ecosystem. And again, generally an increasing trajectory over time. And finally, about research uptake. Similarly, questions about how helpful the program was in helping to develop the skills and the experience. And this just to give you a sense of what people were doing. So about 1/3 of the respondents were involved in some of the activities around research uptake or capacity development, but nearly everybody who responded was involved actively in the research program. So as well as that, those sort of tangible processes, I pointed in the beginning to the need for this intangible software that is itself developed through the more tangible processes, and thinking about norms and power and trust. So I already talked about the very long life of RESYST itself. I think it's quite useful to look kind of to the children or the parents of RESYST. So RESYST operated from 2010 to 18, but actually it had its genesis in very early research programs funded by DFID that were led by Professor Anne Mills. And gradually over the life of these dots, many of the people who ended up being members of RESYST had been collaborators in earlier programs. And so there was this gradual building up of experience and knowledge of each other. We tried very hard from the beginning to have a distributed form of leadership, so that decision-making over capacity development and research uptake and research was shared amongst members of the consortium, and the research themes themselves were not led by the research directors, but by people located in the full set of members. I think another important issue here is the interlinking relationships. So, as with all research programs, it's very rarely do you have the privilege of working on one thing. So many members had interlinking relationships with other projects that were going on, but also they were doing PhDs in different members' institutions. There's quite a rich and complex set of relationships among the members. And finally, there was the mentoring relationships that were established over time. So successes, we produced an awfully large set of research outputs. I was just going back to remind myself what we did. We produced 70 published papers. There were 62 presentations. There were 43 research summaries, and nearly 600 citations of RESYST work in others. We took that as an important sign that the work that we were doing was useful. There were policy influences. That was sometimes it was kind of direct policy change. More often it was helping to shape policy conversations. And those were sometimes conversations at the national level and other times at the global level. But I think one of the really interesting ones was capacity development. So I'm nearly at the end. This is a really busy slide, but it comes out of a session that we had in our very last annual meeting, which was 2 years ago, almost exactly, in Liverpool at the last HSR conference. And we asked people to reflect on how had RESYST impacted them. So this was the researchers who were present, and you can see the number of sorts of domains that are here. So we have professional reputation and career, and the experience of leading and managing work, experience of doing kind of policy influencing and research uptake, teaching and training, gaining knowledge and experience. And I just wanted to, because it's too hard to read, I just wanted to pull out some of the quotations from this this infographic. So people talked about very direct things, helping to make the connections and generate the body of work that supported them to progress in their careers. There were people who through novel ways of working, our learning sites, were much more involved in changing practice and in bottom-up engagement. There were relationships that led to collaborations and new grant applications. And in fact, many of the members of RESYST continue to work together on different programs of work. And then also people have moved somewhat between research and practice. And so I liked this quotation up in the top left-hand corner about the knowledge acquired helping people to actually change and move into implementation roles. So a couple of challenges. So momentum, it was actually a very long time to be together, and people had many other things going on. So it became a real challenge to keep to timelines and to get pieces of work done in time. And I think perhaps one of the things that we did less well was to complete the cross-country syntheses that might have been possible, some of our collaborative work, but also to look across our research themes, across the health workforce, the financing and the health governance work, to be able to draw the main lines of analysis and linkages among them. And that really was a matter of momentum and time. We had some interesting experiences in balancing the need for comparative research, which sometimes had to be done in a fairly kind of stringent and rigidly comparative way, and sometimes those requirements were less, they were country teams needed to do more adaptations to make sure that the research was relevant to their context, and sometimes that led to some tensions. And then the last point was really that there was sometimes a challenge between the funders' desire to promote RESYST as a thing, RESYST as a brand, but recognizing that RESYST was not going to live on forever, but the national research institutions that were members of RESYST had, it was much more important that their profile be enhanced and that they became recognized and recognized providers of reliable and trustworthy information at the national level. So I shall end there and just point you to our website, which does live on 2 years after the end of the project. And there's all of the outputs are there, but there's lots of other bits and infographics of the work that we did together. Okay, over to you, Saz.
Great, thank you so much, Cara, and thanks for introducing a framework which is really helpful to us all for unpacking and thinking about building collaborations in terms of thinking about both the hardware and the software, and both the tangible and the less tangible crucial elements of software. And thanks also for thinking about and giving illustrations of the importance of building and maintaining relationships over time, and also across different projects and activities. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joanna Raven. So Joanna is a senior lecturer in health systems research at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And Joanna also has, as with all of our speakers, huge amount of experience in running research consortia and managed many multi-partner research grants. So over to you, Jo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sassy. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, great. Thank you very much, that's Sassy, and welcome to everybody. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here to share my experiences so far. So I'm going to be going to provide a brief introduction to the programs, then describe some of the approaches we have used in these programs to manage global health research collaborations and some of the challenges that we have faced. So I'm taking learning from several health systems research programs that I've been involved in and where I have played different roles. So Rebuild for Resilience is a research program consortium that I co-lead, and that's on health systems in fragile and shock-prone settings. Rebuild, which is also a health systems program in fragile settings, and Perform, which looks at district health management strengthening, where I played key research roles. And Perform to Scale, where I'm the research director that's on the program that's scaling up a management strengthening intervention. And Redress, where I lead a key program of work on human resources and health systems approach to address severe stigmatizing skin diseases such as leprosy. All of these have multiple partners across a range of countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. So I now want to talk briefly about 6 key areas. So the first one is about agreeing a way of working. So in Rebuild for Resilience, learning from our experience of working in other programs, we recognized it was important to get a common ground of understanding. Why do we want to do this work? Why do we want to work together? How important is this work to us? What other things are we doing? And talking these through up front. So at the start of the program, we did a short survey asking all people in the consortium about what working in partnerships means to them. What are the features of good partnerships? How best partnerships can develop, and how to apply these values to this program. So this slide here with this world map shows some of the values that sort of came out from that survey. So we then had a workshop where we discussed these findings more and identified ways to operationalize these values. So concrete ways in which we could work that really reflects these values, and identifies some practical and feasible quantitative and qualitative indicators that we could track to show if we are working in this way. So for example, open, effective and regular communication came up as a key value. So these were about effective channels of communication which work for all partners, no technical barriers, inclusive in order to keep everyone informed and able to make the right connections, and regular and routine from early on so partners know what it is expected of them. So ways to operationalize those were things like setting up a Teams platform to communicate and share files, WhatsApp for quick communication, sharing minutes of working groups, an internal communication guidance document, that really filters and balances the sharing of information versus overload of information, and a bi-monthly newsletter. So the second area I want to talk about is about decision making. So this is about decision-making responsibility is shared within the collaboration rather than only decisions made by the lead partner, and making sure that the governance structure and mechanisms really reflect this. So the ways that have helped us to support distributed decision-making in our programs are, for example, creating working groups or programs of work where there is joint sharing and representation from all partners. So for example, in Rebuild for Resilience, we have working groups on areas such as research uptake, capacity strengthening, gender equity and justice, where we have developed strategies together. This not only helps in terms of capacity strengthening and learning across the consortium, it also supports buy-in to implement them over the duration of the programme. We've also set up consortium management committees where we rotate who leads the meetings and rotate the agenda topics as well. Partners also make decisions about research that goes ahead. So for example, we put together proposals for research during the COVID-19 pandemic, and all partners viewed and scored the studies and made decisions on which went ahead. In redress, we've got partnerships across all levels of the health system. So we're working at county level with county health teams, community health workers, and also people living with severe stigmatizing skin diseases. So including these people as co-researchers in data collection, analysis, and interpretation, and including these voices in the research outputs. So the third area I want to talk about is about building an effective team. So this is about identifying the staff needed to fulfill the research objectives of the programme early on. So this is across the consortium and within the partner organisations. And key to that also is the roles and responsibilities are agreed early and capacity needs identified and addressed. Equitable allocation of resources amongst partners to allow for recruitment of staff, and dedicated programme management and support, so administration, project management, financial management. So we need to be able to ensure that we've got enough resources to do that, because that enables researchers to focus on research. But it takes time to build the team, and you need resources for this. So in Rebuild for Resilience, for example, partners recruited new staff at the start of the programme, doing this as quickly as possible after the contract signed. And there was a tension within that, trying to get the contract signed, trying to recruit people, but really keeping an eye open for people who had the right competencies for those roles. The next area is about, the fourth area is about embedding capacity strengthening within the core functioning of the consortium. So with the principles of multi-directional, multi-level and needs-based priorities, drawing upon expertise from within the consortium and fostering continuous co-learning. So some examples of this are initiating and developing a cohort of research fellows, which we have done in several programs. So for example, in redress, we've got 2 UK research fellows and 4 research fellows from Liberia who work in and across different themes like health financing, human resources, clinical aspects, but they work across those as well. And they're also from different disciplines. So that cohort is kind of developing itself and developing each other. So they work together on the programme. They have their own personal development plans, which is related to the programme, but also beyond that as well. They support each other, share resources and learning through their own forum and more structured sort of mechanisms such as webinars and writing workshops. In Perform to Scale, we have face-to-face workshops linked to the consortium meetings where we practiced, for example, facilitating the management strengthening intervention and learned from these experiences. And in Perform to Scale also, we've got a series of webinars that really reflect on our experiences of scaling up the management strengthening intervention in all the countries. So learning across those countries and looking at the comparisons across those countries. So the fifth area is about effective communication. So setting up and using an easy to use platform for sharing resources and communication, taking into account time differences and connectivity issues. And we developed guides to use this, allocated time for support for people to develop the skills and opportunities to practice with this technology. We're using a range of communication modes, and we have a really good program coordinator who works on several programs, who's so good at getting hold of people. So she's developed relationships over time and knows what will work with different people. Might use WhatsApp messaging or a phone call, but underlying that is this trust that she has built with people over time. Sorry, that went a bit funny there. Technology issues. But we have better technology than ever, but we need the desire to use that. And this links to relationships across the partnership and our sort of common purpose in terms of communication. And then regular communication across the consortium, including opportunities for the full consortium to come together frequently, every year, face to face, but quarterly, virtually as well in this pandemic times. So we have a research forum in Rebuild for Resilience where all the staff from all the partners come. So not just the researchers, but the communication people, the program staff, and the technical administrative staff to really understand our common purpose and what our common goal is within the consortium. And the final point area is about enabling a learning environment. So developing this as a learning consortium. So this is about creating the structures and spaces to learning throughout the program cycle to ensure adaptations are made and we learn from what has gone well and what hasn't. So the monitoring, evaluation and learning structure designed to allow for open and honest learning from within the program. So this is about developing a strategy, but and also clear and non-onerous reporting mechanisms, but also the spaces to allow for feedback and discussion of problems. For example, in Perform and Perform to Scale, we've done regular surveys after events, which has helped identify ways to run face-to-face and virtual workshops better. We have paired partner mechanisms where we have an EU partner is paired with an African country partner, where we share experiences such as support each other in running management strengthening workshops with district health managers, doing data collection and analysis together. And this helps to reflect on what we have done and how we could do things differently. So my final slide is about some challenges. I think I've talked about some of them already, but some additional ones here of lack of face-to-face meetings can make relationship building challenging, particularly at the beginning of a new program and with new partners. And in Rebuild for Resilience, we've really had to work hard at developing those relationships through the working groups, through the values workshops, and through those one-to-one conversations. The second area is about capacity gaps to support research implementation. So institutional and organisational systems are sometimes not always supportive of research studies. For example, access to libraries and financial systems. So this leads to sort of more identifying capacity strengthening needs and areas and addressing those. So a third one is about delay in obtaining ethical approval for research studies, given the complex nature of multi-party and multi-country research studies. And in an ever-changing world, what is happening in the varied contexts, meeting deliverables can be challenging. And there are pressures of delivery to the funders about these deliverables. But there needs to be a balance between being nimble and having a broad voice, ownership and engagement. And this really highlights the importance of good communication and learning across the consortium. So thank you very much for listening. Those are my thoughts for the moment, and I look forward to discussing them a bit more in the panel and the questions and answers sessions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jo. I hope you can all see me. I can't. Okay, I can see myself again. Thank you so much for that, and for giving a whole host of lessons and strategies to really help us begin to operationalize some of those principles of collaborative management that Nadia introduced for us. And also reminding us all of the challenges, many challenges, but the one of ethics approval across multi-institutional, international research activities is one that I'm sure is familiar to many of us. Thanks all for filling in the poll. We now have 131 votes in there and can see a huge amount of experience in being part of collaborations, including in management. So thank you for continuing to fill that poll. It's now a pleasure, if we could have the next slide, please, to introduce Basiru Bonfa. Before I continue to introduce him, just to say thank you so much for the energy in the comments, and a lot of questions are going in there. We're tracking them and we're going to come back to them in the session of Q&A straight after Basiru's presentation, but also after the break. So Basiru, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Basiru is a professor of epidemiology and public health, and he's also the director of Afrique One Aspire Consortium. And Basiru brings with him huge experience in consortium management, including in One Health cross-sector and cross-francophone and international collaborations. So welcome, Basiru.
Thank you very much, Sasi. I will try to share my slide. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this collaborative session. What I want to introduce here is how we have used the transdisciplinarity capacity to develop partnership and collaboration between many institutions, many countries, and many disciplines. And this experience came from our research at the Centre Suisse de Recherche Scientifique in Côte d'Ivoire, which has 70 years experience in partnership. So I will try to address some of the key issues and shortfalls on those partnerships. So to do that, I have 4 main areas to complete. The first one is to look at the complexity and dynamics that we face. The second one is to show all the approaches we have developed and come with challenges and the strategies we adapted, and then the conclusion. So when we talk about collaboration and partnership, we need to look at the context and how complex is this context. If you look at, for example, in Africa, in rural area with the poverty context, with the emerging issues like antimicrobial resistance and emerging infectious diseases like COVID-19, you can understand that institutions and people and even countries need to adopt a common and joint effort to address this. And for that, collaborations and or partnership need to look at first drivers and then consequences and see how together responses can be given. And beyond the responses, the capacity in addressing the impact or evaluating the impact is also very important. So if you see the Centre Sud de Recherche Scientifique Network and Partnership, we have a vast network with many countries within Africa, outside Africa. We have academic institutions, we have donors, we have private sector, and all those actors have to come and work within sometime project or sometime program, and currently with consortia. So when we build a consortia, the consortia is made out of institution and not only looking at the project. And that's where we want to really address the key element of partnership when we try to work in the consortium. Consortium alone cannot build the capacity, so if it does not address the institutional problem. Then another issue beside the institution is the dynamics of research considering the disciplines. When we address the health problem, there are many disciplines that are contributing to address health problem. And the question is, how do we bring all those disciplines together, knowing that sometimes we have some research which is purely one single discipline, others are multidisciplinary, though some are interdisciplinary, and some need other type of knowledge which is beyond the academic knowledge. So we need to take the cycle of research depending on the response we want to provide to the problem. So it's another collaboration or partnership aspect that need to be addressed. We have the country partnership, we have donors partnership, we have institutional partnership, and we have disciplinary partnership. And then the last part is the knowledge. How do we address the knowledge, or which perspective do all the actors have? And sometimes when you address the health system, it's important that when we collect data, we transform that into information and then derive knowledge. We need to see this knowledge from different perspectives, not only the perspective of, for example, natural science or social science, but also the perspective of the community with whom or on whom we want the impact to be done. So this type of knowledge partnership is also very important. So to address all those partnership challenges, we need capacity and competencies. The capacity alone is not enough if there's no competence. Sometimes we think that training people or providing equipment, furnishing the laboratory is enough. But a capacity is real when a country or an institution is able to handle a problem faced during a crisis like the COVID-19. So this is where we can really see how to introduce mechanism of evaluating the competence of individual and institution. So for that, new approaches are needed, and we think that education, culture, and resources are important. And when we look at the culture, we don't look at the culture as a language only, but how can we share the knowledge and the attitude practices between different countries and the region. So one of the first thing we have developed in our partnership is first to know all the involved stakeholders. Sometimes we fail to know them, and how do we make them to participate? So if you see the number of experts, the number of consortium, and the number of projects, we have only one target group, the population that we want to improve the health. So by going to those populations, we need to know who is coming with which knowledge and under which agenda. So knowing and mapping the stakeholders is one of the key elements if we want to understand the whole process. And then for the health aspect, what we have now developed called the One Health concept is the collaboration, the closer collaboration between disciplines to address complex health problems. And with this collaboration, we use the academic and non-academic knowledge together to generate or to co-develop or co-design an intervention. And this process of co-construction of knowledge should give credit and value to each discipline, each sector, each institution, or each country. Everybody's voice counts. And what we lack here, or we want to develop, is to see a model, maybe a mathematical model of what added value the collaboration can bring, the added value in terms of negative or positive added value. So this is what we try with the One Health concept, to bring all disciplines together so that we can share resources, scarce resources, we can use knowledge, and then improve or design the intervention. And another aspect is in the capacity building is empowering communities. Empowering communities is very important. And sometimes we tend to talk mainly with policymakers, then the communities, and as scientists, I'm talking as a scientist. But the dialogue that we have introduced to bring all stakeholders together to discuss about the problem has provided a very strong contribution to understanding health system and understanding how to intervene. This is an example of a discussion on a result of a project where we brought decision makers, scientists, and the target population to discuss and then see what kind of intervention we want to promote together. And then the last aspect is how knowledge lead to change. Sometimes we think that using local knowledge and academic knowledge together is enough to change things. And the change has a long process until the adoption is done. So in the term of collaboration and partnership, we advise all actors not to stop at the level of knowledge production, but to follow the knowledge production up to the adoption and how this can provide change. And to summarize most of the challenges that I just mentioned, we know that the problems are complex. This is not new. We have institutional fragmentation, geographic, economic, cultural zone. We have also knowledge fragmentation between different regions. And the research agenda setting sometimes is not transparent. And we ask ourselves, whose priority really count when we set the agenda? And this is one of the challenge of the partnership. And another issue is the trust in collaboration with equity that has been already mentioned by my colleague. And the last one is the flexibility in funding, especially with cost sharing and learning from our activities beside only the quantitative indicators. We have tried through the Swiss Cooperation Partnership Principle, which are 11 principles, to see what are the key challenges. And among the 11 principles, we have identified 5 that are really key to the partnership. And at Centre Suisse, when we address a memorandum of understanding or signing contract, we make sure that the 5 critical issues are addressed. The first one is to decide on the objectives together. It's not only one part agenda which is addressed. The second is how do we share the profit and how the results are applied and how do we build on mutual trust. But the number 10 is the research capacity. And this one, we always look at that very critically because we have the disparities in capacity when we take, for example, the European country and African countries, the capacity is not the same. So we try to use the project to balance the capacity in terms of individual capacity, institutional capacity, and sometimes the capacity of a country to address some of the issues. And we also try to bring the language and historical network that can help also to shape the partnership. And for that, the mobility is one of the key elements. Mobility, for example, between Francophone and Anglophone countries, researchers face many constraints. It's not only ethical issues, but mobility of researchers is also very important. So what we tend here to do is to develop a mechanism of lecturer buyout where we use experts from Francophone area to go into Anglophone area and vice versa to exchange their knowledge. Another aspect that we have developed for many decades with Centre Suisse is how consortia or how project or program can help to build institution. And here, one of the advice we always give to consortium coordinator is to think carefully how a consortium can support the institution. A very strong consortium with a weak institution is not sustainable. So each consortium or each project should provide a support to the institution and raise the capacity of the institution. And we see most of the consortia have budget load even higher than the institution. And at that area, we have the power relation, which is not balanced. And it's very important that each project, each consortia think of building the capacity of the institution in different terms. Another area is the resilience we experience in Cote d'Ivoire with this civil unrest, civil war following the election in 2010, where we have tried to see what helped us to continue research during the war zone without compromising the security of our researchers and the communities. And one of the lesson was trust capital that we have built with the communities. So working with the communities is important. We don't want to have silos of research institutions disconnected from the population where research is done. We have also the maintenance of the core funding. Core funding is something that maintains our institution. So in the partnership, if resources are allocated only for project without any support to the core funding with the setup, is it's a big challenge. And developing action beside research is also important. And we were lucky that our institution has a diplomatic immunity. It has helped a lot, but not the only one. And the last one is the commitment of all partners in time of crisis. All partners should put their hand in time of crisis. And sometimes we see when there's a crisis, most of the partners withdraw their activities, leaving institution alone to face, and they come to later when everything has collapsed. And the key strategies that we have developed based on our experience has been published in one of the paper, Leveraging Research Partnership to Achieve the 2030 Agenda. You can have those resources, and I will not read those key strategies. This paper highlights most of the information, how we can design solution-driven research, rethink research assessment and reward system with more empirical evidence. In conclusion, what I want to say is we need to consider partnership and collaboration in long term, in cold or hot times. And we need to avoid opportunistic start-stop partnership. We know that many partnerships start around the project, and when the project ends, it's finished. This need to be taught, and funders need to help to avoid this start-stop system. The equity aspect has been mentioned between disciplines, institutions, countries, regions, and with the evolved equitable partnership, which is very important. And in terms of capacity, we have tried the postdoctoral position in most of our consortia, including IDEAL and others, and it has helped to develop the transition period capacity in our institution. So core funding support is important, empowering community, emphasize on that, and we need to learn from existing long-term partnership. We have very good experiences that need to be taken on board. So I would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that very insightful and rich presentation. Reflecting on it made me wonder if we should be adding to high-level principles for collaborative or collaboration management, co-construction of knowledge across very different actors. I think it's been really helpful to hear about the partnership principles and introducing that framework and thinking about that visual of the flowers and thinking about moving beyond site development to institutional development. So thank you so much for that. And I will now hand over to Prof. Sam Kinyanjui. Sam is the Head of Training and Capacity Building at the Kemri Wellcome Trust Research Programme in Kenya and the director of a large consortium himself. So over to you, Sam.
Okay, thank you very much, Sas. Okay, yeah, I can see myself. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, presenters. I think you have done some really wonderful talks that have touched on very many different aspects of collaboration, consortia, partnerships, and management. And thank you, everybody, for all the questions that you've sent in. Now, we have a lot of questions. We may not have enough time to answer all of them in this session, but some of them will be addressed in the next session, which will be the panel session. So there'll still be opportunities. And if I don't call out your question at this session, doesn't mean that it wasn't noted. We'll try and address them. And in addition, we may be able to get some typed out answers for some of them. And so with that, I just want to go through some of the questions and then ask the panelists to prepare to address them. So the first comments and question came from Swati. Sorry, just getting around to the question. So Manish Dutta is, sorry, coming from Carmen Sandy, I'll be very interested to hear more about power dynamics in research collaborations and how the presenters tackle this in their projects. And maybe Basilu, you may want to take that.
Yes, thank you very much. With the power dynamics is something which is very important. When we talk about power, it's not only financial power or knowledge power. We have also the environment and the legal framework power in the country. So if you have, for example, EU program together with an African institution program, you have researcher coming from the north, working with researcher from the south, and the negotiation of power is very important. And sometimes we tend to look only at the financial aspect because most of the fundings are coming from the north. And we think that the only power is enough. But we have also the knowledge and cultural power, which is also down. So if you don't negotiate very well, you may end up of missing information or missing some of the key issues when research is implemented. So you need to map all the power and not put them into conflict, but try to see how they can complement each other for the objective or the agenda we want to address.
Thank you. I note that Manish Dutta, you have also kind of addressed the same area, and this will be addressed further, I believe, in the panel discussions, asking about the value of involving government as a consortium partner and how that then spans out in consideration to power dynamics. We won't address that question immediately because I think it's been partly addressed by Basiru, but we'll come back to it during the panel discussions. So the next question is from Swati, who says, insightful, makes me think that these are so relevant. So what has been shared, even with local partnerships, including partnerships with local community-based organizations. Is there any difference you see? I would appreciate any thoughts on this. I don't know, maybe between Joanna and Kara. Joanna, would you like to maybe comment on this?
Thanks for that question, Sophie. Yeah, I think basically the same principles lie on all sorts of partnerships about equitable and respect and distributed leaderships and kind of analyzing the power dynamics between them. So I think it works the same way, I think, with community and with civil society organizations. Maybe, yeah, I think all of those, the principles that we've outlined in the presentation so far are really reflected there. So the equity and the power and to really address those early on. And maybe there might be more issues about power when it comes from different organizations and different community level. Maybe there's a sense that they have less power within these sort of negotiations and discussions, but I think it's up to the partnership to discuss that and talk through that and make sure that those are addressed at the early start of developing the partnership and understanding what the different people want from that partnership. I think that's about it from me for that.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe if I want to add on.
Yeah, please go ahead, Basil.
Yes, I raised the issue of stakeholder mapping without forgetting any institution, be it a community or NGO. And when we map them, there's another exercise which needs to be done, is to see at which level all those partners have influence or importance. So most of them can have a very influence negatively or positively on the project, but without being important. So it's very important to dialogue and see how an institution or a partner can come without compromising the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the next question is from Alberto Jr. What are our experience in ensuring that collaborations are sustained even after we, external technical assistance providers, all funders initiated, and after we and our assistants? Usual gaps identified is availability of internal funding from network members. But aside from this, what are other factors affecting sustainability of collaborations and how to address this? Kara, do you want to take this?
Thanks, Sam. I guess it's a problem for all researchers, isn't it? That when projects or programs end, the fuel sometimes for the activities it kind of runs out. As I would say, there's so one issue is kind of diversify. So think about multiple lines of collaboration so that they kind of can overlap with each other and there aren't big gaps in between programs. And that's really easy to say. I think we are all very much at the mercy of the funders. And I note that there's a question in the set of questions from somebody who is a research funder about how to support these partnerships. And I guess maybe we can come back to in the panel discussions. I think there's lots of things that funders can do to avoid this, this stop-start nature of collaboration. But what I would say, so I would say on the one hand, we were in RESYST, we were really lucky that there was really a very long period of research. But I think that what we've seen post-RESYST is that the relationships established were strong enough to sustain ongoing projects. And it wasn't even always among the same members of institutions. It was that the relationships actually became distributed within institutions. It wasn't always the same two people, but the two people might introduce some of their colleagues as well. And those kind of gradually expanded to become a richer set of networks.
Yeah, very interesting. And maybe just later on in the panel, you can comment, the panelists can comment on whether every single collaboration or consortium has necessarily to have an infinite life. There are some collaborations that by nature were designed to only run for so long and then beyond that. So I would like us to move also to the next question. And I think, Nadia, you should address this. You have done quite a bit of work on this. I wanted to hear the panelists' reflection on how to balance the enabling of each partner to pursue original direction of research and be creative with producing joint output to fulfill commitment to the funders and local policy actors?
Right. So I think it starts, and I think it was Joe who mentioned something that's very key in actually addressing this, in thinking through some of the values right from the start. So it has to do with thinking through at the pre-inception or inception stage, the various interests, as well as what the expectations are, what the needs are. And it's a wider stakeholder, not just the members of the consortia, but also the funders, because many of these programs come with, or the funding call comes with requirements from the funder with their expectations as well. And so if it's a wider stakeholder discussion, then it actually promotes everyone bringing their interest onto the table and their needs to the table. And then all of it can be put together and incorporated in the program that is eventually designed and implemented. So I think that's one of the key ways to do that. It's right from the start. Many of the times, what the funder says kind of has more weight, and then you have many members of the consortium trying to go along with it, but behind the scenes may have some inhibition. So some of these open discussions are really key to ensuring that these are addressed and revisited throughout the implementation.
Cara, I think I can see your hand.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that as well? And I think the other thing, it's so much in the nature of health policy and systems research that research is located in a particular place, but there are new insights that come from looking across places, and allowing the time in the research program for those insights to unfold, to enable people to finish their own, the work in a particular setting, but to make sure that there's a time to understand what others have done and to really tease out those higher lessons. And people may have different interests in that as well. It's, because they are focused on, back to Nadia's point, that people have different things they need to get out of these research activities, and being aware of different levels of analysis and who has the opportunity to contribute to them is really important.
And just to add to that, I think it's about creating that space and time to be able to do that, which is critical for the sort of collaboration, really, and the coordination of the collaboration.
Excellent. Good. So the next question, which I will ask the people who participate in the next panel session to just note, and during the break, think about very carefully, so you don't have to answer it right now. This is from Godlieve van Heteren. What is the most radical break with the current practice of research coalition building we should actually be talking about? In other words, the elephant in the room question. I think take time to think about it during the break. Let's take a note of it, and when you come back to the panel session, address it. Jonah, did you hear the question, or are you able to see it? So I'll reread it. It's saying, what is the most radical break with the current practices of research coalition building we should actually be talking about? I.e., what is the elephant in the room that we really need to bring out into the open? Okay, so the next one is from Gina Teddy. Hi, everyone. I really enjoy the speakers sharing their experience, but in cases where funding funders, I presume, or funding is not available to pay salaries, therefore you cannot have a dedicated coordinator. How do you deal with such situations? I would think maybe Basilu, do you want to take but anyone else also who has experience in this? Basilu?
Yeah, I don't know on which one, the radical shift or the second one.
No, the second one. Have you had or any of the three of you, if you've had a situation where you have had been part of a coalition or a collaboration that required a coordinator, but you don't have one. So in other words, you don't have a secretariat to manage some of the primary aspects of the collaboration.
Yeah, I think the coordination is always a big problem. But if you put the coordination within the project or within the program, you may not be able to address that. It's important, as I highlighted before, for us partnership is not between individuals, as Kara said, researchers working together, but it's also between institutions. The most sustainable structure is the institution. And this is where we can find a coordination mechanism. So I don't think that with a coordination mechanism, sometimes with funders, they said, okay, to lead or coordinate, the coordinator must come from the north or from the south, depending on what is the agenda. But if we think sustainability, on my perspective, coordination problem will not arise. We will always find one and even try to see what type additional capacity we can provide to them. We have young researchers now coordinating very big program consortia, but they have never done that. It's a starting point. So why not build the capacity of young researchers to start coordinating? So I'm going to jump in on that.
Because I think also there's many kind of levels of complexity of research. So for a research project that is perhaps more time limited and more issue limited and more scale limited, that coordination job isn't as heavy. But as soon as you do get to these multi-partner programs of work, they can't be done without investing in the core. They need that because not just because it allows the researchers to do the research, but also it's a particular skill required to be always listening and always being attentive to the relationships among the partners. And so that's something around speaking to funders, that for complex programs of work, you need a coordinator and you can't do them without that investment in the core.
Right. Yes, it's very, very important. And we have this experience together that now the African Academy of Science is addressing with all consortia, where they are asking us to cost how much will be the coordination and put that in the program so that we don't end up of leaving these parts to the weak institution struggling to collect his core funding to pay salaries or pay electricity.
Excellent. So I think we need to wrap up this session, but maybe just to very quickly speak a bit to the last comment. Part of what Nadia's PhD, in fact, the core of Nadia's PhD is looking at consortium management. And I think the most important finding that is emerging is how little attention and focus has been hitherto given to the management and coordination in itself as a right and in itself as a key capacity and as an important element of ensuring that the consortia or collaborations succeed. And so we want to push that funders recognize that it's very hard, it's not just a science, that there are other measures of a successful collaboration, even when sometimes some of the scientific deliverables were not achieved, and not just measure the success of collaborations in terms of publications. Yes, good. So I think with that, I'll send us back to Sasi to tell us what's going to happen next. Thank you everybody for your participation. Thank you presenters for the wonderful responses.
Thanks very much, and to you all, presenters, but also all of those really great questions and inputs through the chat box. And I know that we're going to come back to that after the break. So we're to have a 10-minute break now. During this break, we would really appreciate it if you could carry on thinking about and inputting on these areas here. So inputting into the chat box so that we can pick up on them and also refer to them after this session if we don't manage to get round to them. But thinking about additional principles that might be important for us to be thinking about in collaborations. Thinking about key challenges faced or inputting on key challenges that you've faced in managing consortia that perhaps haven't come up already. And thinking about top tips to share, strategies and resources to overcome and work with some of those challenges. And I think also to think through the question of how do we break with some of the power relations and norms, the elephant in the room that we continue to be aware of and that remain a challenge. So thank you all. We've got 10 minutes now. It's at least here, 1/2 the hour. It'll be different hours in many different places. So back in 10 minutes time, where we'll continue with a panel discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody. Hope you managed to grab a cup of tea or water or something appropriate to give you more energy for the next part of this session. So thanks again to the speakers and to Sam for moderating the first round of Q&A. My name's Lucy Gilson, and with Justin Pulford, we are going to be moderating this panel discussion. So I think in the panel discussion, what we want to try and do is get into some of the sort of nitty-gritty of experience. There are clearly a lot of questions that have come in. We haven't yet been able to answer them all. We may not be able to answer them all, but we're certainly going to try and address them one way or the other. Can I also ask you to start sharing experience? We all have experience, and the poll has indicated that. So it isn't only the panelists who have advice to share. Please, whoever you are, whatever your experience is, please also share your top tips for how to manage collaborations and how to manage engagements. So the way we're going to run this panel session is that I'm going to start off by asking the panelists to address some more issues. Justin's going to be keeping an eye on the incoming questions and experiences. And after about a quarter of an hour, we'll swap roles so that you get to hear from a diverse range of people and have a wider set of views and ideas being brought to the table. Just to clarify that I was one of the research directors of the RESYST Consortium and have also managed other collaborative, not only research, but educational projects as well. So it's really good to be here with you all. We are 171 participants. I know we can't be in the same room together, but I am really amazed by the level of engagement, and that's just fantastic that virtual platforms allow us, so many of us, to connect. So without further ado, just a reminder, please be plugging in your top tips, your experiences to share, as well as your questions. I'd like to turn to the elephant in the room to start with. And I guess we may all have different elephants, but I see that as North-South dynamics in a world of decolonization and calls for decolonization in a complex and challenging environment that we all face. I think we've begun to address a little bit some of the lessons that there may be from the experiences, but I want to hook North-South dynamics to Godley's challenge. What are the new ways of doing business that we need to think about moving forward? How do we recognize that it is the case that Northern institutions have networks, collaborations, histories, people, traditions that enable them to be the leaders of collaborations quite often, but not always? Mm-hmm. And how is that power shared when we come to collaborations? But more importantly, how is that power handed over? Not just shared, but handed over. What top tips, what lessons of experience do we have about new ways of doing business? I'd like to ask the panelists to raise a hand if they'd like to go first, so that I can see who's willing to start the conversation off. Okay, yes, thank you, Cara. So let me say I'm going to go to Cara first, then I'm going to come to Bas. Thank you, and then the other two you'll be able to have your chance. Cara.
Yeah. So I guess one thought is that I thought with two parts. So 1A is if Northern funders are reluctant to hand over the holding of the funds to Southern institutions, that really does constrain the kind of the authority. The authority, because ultimately the responsibility lies with the person who signs the contract with the funder, and that's where a lot of the power sits. And so I think there is an element just the simple sort of contractual things around who is responsible. But I think the decision making and the governance of the relationships does become quite different if you design them to be participative, and that means giving up control, right? That means for us Northern researchers not being in control of the research questions and not being in control of the review processes, and really kind of stepping back and being in a supportive role where our where our input is required, rather than necessarily believing that we ought to be in the lead. I hope that we can come to this, and Sam, I'm sure that you will have views on this as well, but there is an issue also of where the money comes from. And I think as long as the big health systems research money is coming from Northern governments and Northern institutions, then again, that's another source of power. And so national governments need to step up and say, these issues are important to us, and we will put some of our funding into making sure that there is a nationally led and controlled research infrastructure that will help to deliver the research that we want. Over.
Great, thanks so much, Cara. So issues of, where does the funding come from? Who holds the funding? What are the funders requiring with respect to funding? But also issues to do with the governance structures of collaboration and the decision-making practices of collaborations. And we've shared some experience about that already. So Bas, I wonder what your thoughts are. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have 2 comments here to do and give example that we had, and maybe some can also complement. In 2008, the Wellcome Trust has launched what was called the African Institution Initiative, where the applicants were African scientists leading the consortia. And we have seen that by doing that, we were able to use this funding as leaders and bring Northern partners under the umbrella of the program. And we have seen how this has changed and raised the capacity of scientists to coordinate and to manage this type of grants. So this shift is very important, but still some of the funders, when applications are mentioned, always want the leadership to be driven from the north. And this is where we have a problem. And some will say, okay, where the money is coming, people have power. Then come my second comment. When we say that the money is always coming from the north, depending on the cost estimation of research, it may not be true. Maybe research funding is coming from the north, but when you assess how much an institution or a country is putting in the project management, it can be sometimes be a huge matching fund. And sometimes we fail to evaluate that, and we think that all funding is coming. For example, when you take researcher salaries, you take the facilities, you take the training of people, you take the electricity, you take water, you take all the setups. It's very important to cost and see how much our countries are bringing. And then come to the third comment, where we should not only lie to the 2 points I mentioned, taking the leadership from Northern funding or estimating our funding, but bringing our government also to put something in research, not only in the capacity, but in research. And this is where things can be done more easily. Thank you. I would stop here.
That's fantastic, Bess. Thanks so much. So a really good example of funders doing things differently, importantly, but also a recognition that there is funding within our own countries, and how does that brought to the table? And there are unfunded costs that are part of these endeavours. Joe, I wonder if you'd like to chip in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I was an experience that I've had over maybe a few years ago was about a project that was led by a Southern institution, but
We've lost your sound, Joe.
Oh. Can you hear me?
That's good. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I think you're accidentally muted.
It's my computer's alive on its own.
Lost you again.
Okay, let's try again. Let's hope it stays. Okay. I'm not doing anything to this.
Okay, can I move to Nadia and
Yeah.
maybe we can try and get some tech assistance? Forgive me. I know a great thought is coming. Nadia, over to you.
Right, so I just wanted to add that sometimes what is said or articulated to be the purpose for some of these collaborations coming from funders and some of the northern institutions is not necessarily translated into what happens on the ground. So I'll give an example for capacity strengthening collaboration. So many times the purpose for some of these collaborations will be to strengthen the less strong institutions or countries. But then the way the programs are run, sometimes even management, and we give the example of sometimes not even allocating resources to coordination on the ground. Even the management is seen to be a drag. The focus is always on delivering the outputs quickly so that the reports would be given. Without forgetting that in ignoring or avoiding or neglecting that side, the capacity that the host or the local institutions need to be able to also apply for their own grants and sustain what they need to do to answer their local research questions is not built in the case. Another example is equity, which everyone seems to raise as important in the space of research as well as capacity strengthening. But equity also involves giving the same opportunities to less strong or LMIC institutions when it comes to allocating funds, and not just looking at the capacity, those with the high capacity to be able to be the leaders of collaborations or to even have access to the funds. And the examples that Prof. Bashiru gave in terms of deltas and giving the lead to African institutions. There's also the MEPI that happened by the NIH. It's through some of the African institutions to the deep end, but that is where they learned. I was a program manager for one of these MEPI institutions, and most of the research management and grant management I got to learn was because I was given the opportunity to be able to lead and report directly to funders when we didn't have much on the ground, and we built capacity out of that. So I think most times the purpose should match what is really practiced on the ground.
Thanks, Nadia. So Joe, have we got you back?
I think so.
Yes, great.
Good. Yeah, I was just going to say about an experience I've had with a project that was led by a Southern institution, but the funding came to us, which was a very bizarre way of going about it. And the reasons were about financial management, basically. So I think one area that I think we really, is to support country institutions to develop capacity on financial management so that they can actually apply for research grants and hold the money, which is what they should be doing, really. And I think that's a critical area of support, I think, really, that we should be addressing.
Great. So we've already begun to address one of the other questions. And so maybe we can just track this other question. What lessons do we have for funders in the way they support collaborations? And we've already had quite a few ideas around that. And let's just keep in mind that the funders are not only the global funders. As Bas said, we also need to direct lessons to national funders. I want to ask one more question at this stage. So let's just go back in time. In fact, all of your consortia and your collaborations have a past and a history, and Kara brought that out very clearly. But imagine you are a low middle income country organization and a researcher in a low middle country, and you're looking to establish collaborations. You're looking to create networks. You're looking to engage with others, not exclusively to secure funding, although that is important, but to be able to learn, to be able to share, to be able to build ideas, knowledge, and ultimately change in health systems. What are our lessons for how you even begin to start thinking about collaboration and working towards collaboration. Nadia, is that one you'd like to take first? Can I throw that to you?
Yeah, I can start that. I was smiling because it actually came up a lot in my work. Like most times, you need to be in the circle to be in the circle, and this question came up, and it's still something I turn around in my head as to how you get in the circle. And so you have some institutions or potential partners that, for instance, do not have the capacity to participate in current research, and so do not even meet other collaborators to get on board. But I think what needs to be done does not only fall on them, as in those who want to collaborate, but it falls on those who are already in collaborations to be able to open the space up. If you look at Africa, for example, if you look at Central Africa, there's very few collaborations where you have countries from there participating. It takes deliberate effort for funders, for existing collaborations to say, we want to do this. There's one of the Delta's consortia that actually did that. It's like, we really want to include the Lusophone and the Francophone in our collaborations. And they went looking for them. It was a lot of work because the infrastructure on the ground normally would discourage you, but they kept pushing just to get one on board, hoping that in future it will build from there. So as much as those who want to become part of collaborations would need to extend their networks, reach out to others, those who are already in networks also actually need to do more. We can't hear you, Lucy.
Yes. Okay.
Unmute, thank you. Bas, I was going to throw it to you next. Thanks so much, Nadia.
Okay, following Nadia's comments, I have two comments to bring here. When we started working from Francophone with Anglophone countries, all of a sudden we realized that we had the same objectives, but it was for me very easy and less costly to keep my Francophone network than open to the Anglophone. And when you assess the cost is high, and sometimes or the does not mechanism to help this kind of partnership. And because of that, you tend of keeping your own network because it's most easy. You don't have an added value for that. But if in the call, it stipulates that those who are open can have an advantage, this can help and accelerate sometimes knowledge and accelerate research. The second comment is that in Africa, to be honest, for example, Sam, Nadia, and others, my colleague from Africa, I met them not because we have met in Africa, it's through the Northern institution. And that's what we think the Northern institution can play to help Southern institution to liaise and to collaborate. We don't value that importance, but it's very, very important. And sometimes you see, you go to a conference and you see that even within one country, you are both working with different institutions, but you don't talk to each other. But if the Northern institution or other institution can help to develop that, it can provide a very good lesson. And this also we can put that in the frame of the historical relationship. We are more linked to France with the Francophone institution, Institut Pasteur and others. And you will see that with Anglophone, they have also their set of institutions. And we have now tried together with some of the Northern institutions to say, okay, we want to collaborate with you. Like for example, we are doing now with Belgium. We want to go to Central Africa with DRC and others, but we think that you can help us, University of Liège. So we brought University of Liège in our network in order to be able to open the partnership in Central Africa. So you see, this kind of mechanism need more reflection and how to reinforce that. Thank you.
Great. That's a really great point. Thanks, Bas. I really appreciate that. I think we also, it's also about what role Northern institutions can play, and that's important to think further about as well. So, Cara, I see your hand.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So one, Bas, your narrative reminded me of this term in economic sociology, the strength of weak ties, right? So if you, and the analogy comes from looking for a job. If you only ask the people that you know already about, where could I find a new job, they'll tell you all the same things that you know already. And what you really need to be able to find a job is a bridge to a new information source. And that might come from taking a risk and using a weak tie, something, a group or an individual or an institution or a country that you're not so familiar with. And then that just kind of takes you to a whole new world of connections. And so it's interesting that going to Liège, which may not have been a strong partner of yours, is saying actually that they will be a bridge to a set of partners that we really want to work with. And that might be a useful way to think about. The other thing is then about the weak ties always involve some risk, right? You don't know quite where you're going to go. And so thinking about how do you manage risk in research programs. And I just think that that my own institution is very risk averse. I think funders are relatively risk averse, and I know that research partnerships tend to be a bit risk averse. We want to do things we know will work, and we have to kind of reframe the incentive system. So if things don't work so well, it doesn't matter. That there's learning from that, and that there's a chance to fail fast and learn quickly. And I think that that's really important as well. And that's where these large research programs become such an important vehicle, because they give you the space to do some things that are fairly safe and some things that are fairly risky, because across the whole balance of work, you know that there could be some fantastic returns, but there'll at least be some things that you're fairly certain of. Over.
Thanks, Cara. A really important point about managing risk and about allowing risk and allowing challenge and failure in order that we can learn, and not being stuck in the past just by what has worked.
But encouraging it. And I think, Bas, you said something about it, again, that the funders are very powerful here. If the funders say, you must find someone to work with that you have no history with, wouldn't that be an interesting challenge and a really exciting challenge, rather than telling us to show why we're low risk because we've all worked together before?
Yeah.
Joe, I'm going to give you a chance. Nadia, I see your hand. Let's take Joe first, and then maybe you can have the last word on this round, Nadia. Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I was jotting a few things down here, and I've got like being brave and taking risks is what this is about, isn't it? It's about reaching out to different partners that you're not used to working with to develop those links and those different networks. And it is about these bigger research consortia that can sort of bring in new partners, as well as maybe the existing, the sort of normal partners that we usually work with. So having a range of that to sort of reduce the, to make it much more exciting, I think, but also to manage that sort of risk that we seem to think might be there. And others might think that are there as well too.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Thanks so much. Nadia, last word.
Right. So I just wanted to say that sometimes we also need to redefine what we mean by the returns and the risk. We see it as risky because maybe the performance have been seen as, okay, we need to have 7 people trained or 10 publications. And because we don't have that, everything else is risky or not giving the return. So I think we need to have that conversation and have it with the funders as well, because we normally as collaborations keep our eye on the evaluations, and so are not willing to take some of these risks, but to have these conversations with the funders. So for instance, for some of these collaborations that are even primarily capacity strengthening, we can have the discussion and say, this is the purpose, but even though we get only 1 graduate from there, this is what we have gotten. You draw out performances or results that are not necessarily in the indicators that have been listed by the funder, that we built new networks that we can carry on from there, that we've got 2 people who had no idea, had never worked with Anglophones, Francophones, that they can carry on even beyond this. So we changed the language so that even funders begin to understand, not only are they assessing, but they are also educated a bit on what is going on, so long as we are achieving the purpose that they themselves have set up, for instance, capacity strengthening. We say, well, these are also strengthening capacity, so we need to be open to those. Thanks.
Thanks, Nadia. That's beginning to talk a little bit perhaps to how we monitor and evaluate what we're doing, and the need for some flexibility in that. But I'm gonna pause now and throw the ball to Justin. Bas, I saw your hand, but forgive me if I throw the ball to Justin for this time, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to you. Over to you, Justin.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I'm going to change the dynamic a little bit at this point and move over to participant questions. So questions that have been coming in from the audience. And as much as possible, we'll try and make this rapid fire. We did ask for top tips, and I've seen a tip come in, so let me start with this. It's not a question, just to share it to the group. Top tip from Sylvia Ani: funders should remember context as they design research calls and involve stakeholders in putting together mechanisms that work. Context is critical. So a very important message there. Okay, now moving to a question, and there many have come in, so I'll rattle off one, perhaps get 1 or 2 responses and then move on to the next. There's a really interesting one here from MeJumbi at yahoo.com. I was hoping to hear more about formal and informal relationships and collaborations, the importance of each of these, and how and when to apply each of these, and how to balance these to be able to harness the best of them, but avoid the potential pitfalls. And there's a nice example here where Bassero talks about avoiding start-stop collaborations. This is going to depend a lot on strong informal relationships. When you find start-stop situations, most likely you have a very formal relationship with minimal informal, in his opinion. So what is the panelists' experience? Perhaps because Bassero is referenced in this question, we can start with you, Bassero.
Yeah, thank you very much. With experience, we have seen that collaboration always start, beside what I have seen, start informal because you know somebody and you decide to work together on a project and you apply, you make an application. Then when things come, this is where formalization is important. You should not keep into the informal collaboration. You have to formalize with what we call a MOU around the project or between institutions. Even if you don't have projects, you can make a formal, open collaboration trying to access funding. Because when you keep into informal, now funders around projects do not allow informal because they ask many of the papers. We have just talked about the risk management and all those kind of things. So it needs to be formalized, and this formalization needs to take into account most of the principles that we have mentioned. If you miss one principle, which is important for one part, you may try to compromise the relationship. So we have seen also most of the projects, even if they are formal, they still tend to use informal relation to speed some of the issues or activities. But it can work if you have good results. But when you are in a mess, or you are working, for example, without ethics and something happens on a patient, then you are really in trouble.
Okay, thank you, Bassero. Because we're getting so many questions, I'm going to move through them quite quickly, perhaps rather than get each panelist to speak to each question. So another one, this one's come in from Annabelle Grieve. I work for a UK funder and would be interested to hear thoughts from the speakers on what funders can do to support effective and equitable research collaborations, or what is currently missing. So, who would like to take a stab at that?
I can start from where Nadia has mentioned on equity. We all have experience. I think, Nadia, you made it very clear. In the low and middle income countries, we have different level of institutions. So if you want a performance, good performance in science, then you will fund only brightest and high, strong institution. And where the problem comes is where you have weaker institution. We can even go beyond institution and go to countries. In countries where capacity is less, this is where we have emergence of diseases. You have seen Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea issue. So if you tend to only put money where you want to have good result, quick results, it can work, but it's just like putting sometimes the concrete on the mud foundation. So it's important to consider weaker institutions. And this is where we have to take also a risk. Sometimes with our institution, I think some know something about that. We are receiving a strong institution funding, but we are bringing in weaker institution to build the capacity. But sometimes when you are evaluated, you can provide good science, but when time comes to reporting, financial reporting or what type of report, you see that the report is weak and you may end up stopping the project because the institution is not delivering, not in science, but in the governance side. So how do we build that if we don't have resources? So those are the main challenges that need to be addressed when we talk about equity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Basra. Cara.
I jump in. So that idea of, I think we talked, this is a follow-on from that previous conversation around setting the goalposts for where you want them to be, right? So that I think, be imaginative in terms of what you're calling for. But I think some of the things that have come through the past experiences as well is, fund the core. The core is needed to enable the development of capacity, the development of networks. And I guess allow for investment in the software. Right, the budgets need to allow for people to spend time together, developing relationships, developing new ideas, building new skills, and then allow enough time for these things to unfold. We were very, very, very lucky with the RPCs, and the RPCs that DFID has funded do last 5 or 6 years, and that's enough time for these things to begin to unfold.
Okay, thank you, Cara. I'm scrolling through for the next question here. This one from Rosie Steege. I'm keen to learn more about how to measure and report changes in capacity development and equitable partnerships. The Likert scale from RESYST was interesting. Were there other methods used to demonstrate this to funders? Perhaps we can start with you, Joe, this time.
Yeah, so I think you can do it like surveys and kind of trying to track those sort of indicators of equitable partnerships. So I talked earlier about Rebuild for Resilience and identifying those kind of values, and then having some indicators to look at those sort of values and trying to track those over time through surveys, through qualitative research methods, through just discussion throughout the program. And I think that would be a good way of looking at how those equitable partnerships are working. But things like the publications, sharing the authorship and the leadership of publications across the consortium, or other products, or other policy briefs, etc. And also about the leading of research projects. So with Rebuild for Resilience, that we've got these small responsive funds, research funds that research projects that are led by the partner organisations, and how those develop over time, and how the capacity is strengthened through doing those research projects together, you know, because they're across the different partner countries as well. So it's kind of measuring that through the outputs, through the discussions with the people involved. So those are some of the ways that I think that do work in showing how equitable partnerships are developed.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. And Cara, you would like to add to that? And then maybe
Yes,
Nadia.
also the issues around how do you track, you know, capacity development. There are the measures, the indicators, but there's also the stories. So how do we capture, you know, these narratives or histories of people who joined a research collaboration like I did when I was first started, and you know, and that sort of transition into different roles, you know, both within an organization and then be able to work across organizations. I think that sometimes these things are best captured qualitatively.
Thanks, Karen. And Nadia, you were wanting to comment?
Yeah, just to quickly add to what has been said, that it's very useful to be mindful of what the baseline was. And many times we don't get the baseline of the different contexts and different partners within the collaboration. So the collaboration is working with, you know, one idea of what capacity strengthening means. So it will be useful to have what the baseline is across the diverse group of partners, and then also to realize that research is a broad spectrum concept. It's not just the production of research, even just the strategic decisions or the strategic relationships within institutions to start the conversation of thinking about our own research and changing the culture is change. And it might be change for one institution, but it might not be for the other because they have moved ahead. And for them is when they count papers, for instance, that is research capacity strengthening. So it's very essential to think about the context. You mentioned that, Justin, and also to think about the diversity and the baseline and where partners have moved from and where they have gotten to.
Thank you, Nadia. And Jo, it seemed like you had a burning contribution there.
No, I was just drawing on the qualitative, the comment about using qualitative research methods. And I know that from the Rebuild programme that we really developed some case studies about capacity development that really shone how capacity strengthening was capacity in research and research uptake was developed over the course of the programme. And they were really, they've been written up as you know, case studies for funders, but also in other ways as well. That they really highlight and shone the sort of the depth and the detail of that capacity strengthening.
Thank you, Jo. I've been.
Can I add something?
That's right, of course, please.
Yeah. The baseline is important. Quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators are also important. But what I want to highlight is that when you are assessing the indicators in the short term, you can have more quantitative information. But if you want changes, it's a long term that capacity can be assessed in the long term, not in the scope or the frame of the project time. And this sometimes donors don't consider that you can have major change even 10 years, 15 years after a program. Thank you.
Very true. Okay, that was an attempt to go through some questions quick fire. I guess when you have such a informed and experienced panel, it's not possible to answer these questions quickly. Too much experience and knowledge to share. At this point, I'll hand back to Lucy.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. You see, we're trying to bring quick fire, even virtually. I've been having a look at some of the other questions, and you know, we are addressing some of your questions, not all of them. There's been a question about, can you have the slides and so on? My understanding is all of these sessions are being recorded and the recordings will be available. So please look out for that. I hope I'm right, but I think that's the case. In terms of this conversation, I want to move us slightly, still talking about power, but now talking about knowledge power. And an issue, a couple of people have raised issues to do with, in a sense, who defines the research question? Whose voice is dominant in that process? And around this, I'd like to ask you to think not only about the North-South dynamics, but about the researcher, policymaker, researcher, community dynamics. So what experience do we have to share about how to democratize, if you like, the process of defining questions in the first place and of identifying research needs, if you like. And perhaps also there's a disciplinary issue here as well. We often respond to calls that are framed by diseases. And those of us who are health systems researchers don't always find that very easy. We do have some dedicated health system research funding, which is great, but we're dealing with multiple sort of knowledge power dynamics in this field. So I've thrown quite a lot at you. You can pick any one of those knowledge or power dynamics that you'd like to think a bit about, but can we have some thoughts on that? Who'd like to go first? Joe, thank you.
Thanks. So I just wanted to reflect on one of the programs that I'm working on is Redress, and that is about addressing severe stigmatizing skin diseases like leprosy. But it's taking a health systems and human resource angle on that. And that's in Liberia. And that was a question that the Ministry of Health came to the research team with. They wanted something to be done about this, about the looking at how you integrate the management of these illnesses within the health system and how you look at it from a health system, human resource, health financing, clinical and patient-centered approach. So they came with wanting that research to be done, and the research team went and looked for the funding to be able to do that research. So that was really coming from them, and they're a partner on the research program. So that was kind of quite a, I mean, it's not usually happens like that. So it was a really nice time to be part of that and see it coming from the country and the policymakers, and the policymakers being really involved in the research program. So it's kind of like you've got an avenue of research uptake almost immediately, you know, because sometimes you feel like this research is being done, but who's listening to this research? How do we get into policy and practice? And this was a really good way of how it had happened, really. But that was built on previous research and relationships with these policymakers and knowing the context really well. And I think that's what, you know, it's a very powerful process, I think.
Thank you, thank you. I wonder if I can throw the question to Bas, because in your presentation you spoke about transdisciplinarity, multi-stakeholder engagements. So how do we construct or develop research questions differently? Over to you, Bas.
Thank you very much. I think the way the real research system works is that you are a researcher, there is a call on a very specific disease or problem, and then you apply. And when you apply, you come within your institution or your country and try to see how this can fit the problem context. And sometimes we face problem that the subject you are bringing with your funding, the moment you want to negotiate with the communities or the policymakers, sometimes you have some tension and you need to renegotiate and either include or remove some of the issues. So this is the first exercise that a researcher faces when the research question is addressed without taking the country priority. The second level of mechanism we have is that annually we meet together with, we have the chance at Central Swiss, for example, to discuss and report annually to the ministry, different ministries. And we have in the health surveillance side, some of the problem coming from the community. So we set a certain number of problems and priorities that we have to address, either addressing the problem or addressing the solution. But it's rare that if you have these ideas, problem and solution driven research, that it matches the funders' call. But we always use resources and then try to manage. Otherwise, the negotiation is very, very difficult. And this is where additional capacity is needed from the researchers to use the academic, as I say, academic knowledge, and then confront to the local knowledge and negotiate, and then come with something that can be acceptable. You can publish, yes, but at the end, you are a researcher within the communities, and they are looking at you. What are the outcome of research? So you need to provide answers. And in one of the principles is that your research should drive to action, and then you liaise with NGOs or others to make intervention. So it's one part of the principle of partnership to consider the priority of the countries.
Great, thanks. I'm going to throw it to Cara now. Nadia, come back to you, but thinking from the perspective of a large research consortium that tried to do an awful lot and tried to address country research needs, I mean, what were some of the challenges and what were some of the lessons?
Yeah, so I think there's a real tension, isn't there, between people who, particularly where there's a desire to make a disciplinary contribution versus one to make a policy relevant ones. And sometimes there's a conflict between those two things. And I think it's really important to think about how those conversations take place, because I think one could argue that it's unethical to do research that doesn't have practical implications. On the other hand, we also are interested in ideas, and sometimes there is research which isn't immediately useful. So what is the space for doing research that isn't immediately useful, and how do we negotiate that? I think the other thing that is interesting is the dialogue that needs to take place between policymakers and researchers to move from an issue or a problem, which is often the way that policymakers frame the challenge to researchers. I have this problem. It's often not framed as a research question or even as a researchable question. And that requires investment of time and energy and negotiation to move from an issue to something that can be done to a research project that can deliver some of the answers to that question. But so I think again, sort of it's an issue of a space for dialogue, isn't it? And making the time for that, to be able to hear each other and learn about how each other thinks, to come to an outcome that delivers for everybody who's at the table.
Thanks, Cara. So Nadia, your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Cara has touched on it, the need for dialogue. That was the main thing I wanted to put out here, that it takes a lot of conversations as well as building relationships, because these dialogues build the relationships between the different stakeholders. So maybe in the first round of activities, one partner's or one stakeholder's voice was louder, and so that drove the research. But as dialogue continues, and then the communities or the researcher representing the communities begin to bring to the fore the questions that are key, that need answers. Funders, for instance, are flexible sometimes. Sometimes they can't be flexible if the case is made enough for a certain need, even if not within the specific program. That might even trigger a follow-on or supplementary program that would address the need, because invariably the health of the population is what is the main purpose for most of the work that we do.
Thanks, Nadia. I'm going to hand it over to Justin, and just before I do, I guess I'm going to throw in an idea of my own, which is to do with the types of methods we used and the the ways in which participatory approaches and action learning approaches allow the questions to be thrown up as part of the cycle of research, and they can be implemented with multiple partners so that the next round of research builds on the previous round. And in that way, I think one also makes disciplinary contributions as well as substantive relevance to local context. But enough from me, back to you, Justin.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. We're certainly working this panel hard. You'll be pleased to know, panelists, we're coming up to the last 10-15 minutes now. So let me return to some of the questions from the audience members. We have one here from Olubenga Salako, which is specifically directed to Bassero. To quote the question, the session has provided some important insights regarding the decolonisation of global health collaboration. This question is to Bassero. Why would it be the role of institutions from the North to improve collaboration among Southern institutions or researchers? So over to you, Bassero.
Yeah, I mentioned one role is opening the networks, helping to open the network that the Northern institution has, and also looking also from the funders network, how this can contribute. The second is what we call the capacity. The capacity can go in different areas. If you look, for example, publication, how do you share authorship? Or if it comes to collaboration, what are the responsibilities of each of the member in that? And there are many, many other issues. But one of the critical issues that we have identified is to help set the governance structure of the institution, the partner institution in the South. If it's science, I think we have the same scientific education. But when it comes to the governance structures, the finance management, all those things, I think we still need a lot in that. So if this is strong, then we can go and compete together. That's why now most of the institutions are building their, what they call the good financial system, where we try to have a certification. And to have this certification, you must also show that you are in partnership with strong institutions in the North who are backing you and helping to have internal audit and so on. So there are many, many things that we can provide without just taking the position of the Southern institution, because in terms of science, as I said, we can do the same thing.
Okay, thank you very much, Bassero. I have another question here from Pragati Heba. What are some of the accountability measures that help in ensuring meaningful global research? Sorry, I've got my pronunciation wrong there, emphasis wrong. What are some of the accountability measures that help in ensuring a meaningful global research collaboration, such that each partner comes out gaining from such partnerships with respect to each partner's capacity and strengths, and builds trust rather than doubt among partners? So accountability measures. Who on the panel would like to speak to that?
Can start.
Thank you, Nadia.
Right, so when it comes to collaborations, and I think we've noticed that most of them are specifically funded by externally funded, particularly in specific programs or with grants. And the voice of the funder holds a lot of weight when it comes to how operations are run, even in terms of the management, and particularly when it comes to accountability. So that's one area that can be drawn or emphasized when it comes to equitable collaborations. So the funder, for instance, can put measures. And Kara made an example earlier on, stating the fact that if the funder puts in the call that the collaboration should have one partner that they have never worked with, how strong would that be? And we've seen examples of having funders saying this has to be a South-led collaboration. And it can go further to even talk up. Sometimes there are budget considerations. It can be said that the Northern partner can only get 20% of the budget because the funder has a certain purpose in mind. So there can be thoughts or thinking around how to put in practical stipulations within the program to ensure that these things happen. And then now collaborations would actually be accountable to that, or would seek to be accountable in those spheres because the funder has stipulated those.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. That's right.
On the accountability, sometimes when you look at, I'm going to talk about a consortia and an institute. And I raised that in invitation. You have the consortium running a project, but at one time when you look in the contract, the accountability fall on the institution, but not on the consortium itself, which does not have the legitimacy, the institutional legitimacy. And sometimes it's very tricky that the institution, the head of institution don't want to take the responsibility on some of the issues that were not very clear when the consortium was set up. So that's why I'm really supporting that a consortium on its own is not an institution, but all the contract, the elements of MOU must comply with the institution or the country rules and regulation. And this is where accountability can be very transparent and shared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Basara. I'll ask another question just to keep the flow going and to get through some of these many very good questions coming from the audience. This one is from Robinson Karuga. Please share experiences on how you've documented outcomes of multi-directional mentorship in your consortia. So perhaps we'll start with Kara or Joe on this one. So documenting multi-directional mentorship within your consortia, or perhaps even talking through what that might look like.
Yeah, so I don't think that we documented multi-directional mentorship. We certainly had some mentoring relationships, and what I would say is actually the formal mentoring relationships tended to be fairly hierarchical in the sense of a more senior mentor and a more junior mentee. And I actually think there's a tremendous amount of learning to be done by reversing those and actually saying, you know, what do reverse mentorship relationships look like, and where are the, you know, where is the expertise amongst you know, more junior. At one point I really wanted a smart young person to teach me how to use Twitter, for example. So that's a kind of a trivial example, but you know, there are, so I think rethinking mentoring relationships would be really interesting and really valuable for these, because the assumption is always that the expertise lies with the more experienced person, and I don't think that's always true.
Okay, thank you, Kara. But we are getting towards the end of this session, so maybe in an attempt to make this a bit more quick fire as we get to the end, I'm going to pose a choice, and I would like to briefly hear from each one of you as to what your preference might be and why. So when it comes to consortium management, you know, broadly speaking, we could have centralized management systems where the bulk, or you know, all of the management is centered within one particular partner or secretariat, or decentralized systems where the management functions are spread across multiple partners. Preference and why? Starting with you, Joe.
I think decentralized across all the partners, because then in that way people have ownership of the program. It will build capacity over time, which enables future research collaborations to go ahead, and for those partners to lead those research collaborations, which I think would be how I would like to see everything going. I think there's challenges with that, and I think that there would still need to be some coordination and support from maybe the lead partner within that as well. So that's my choice, though.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Bassero.
Yes, both can be done depending on sometimes the funder and the context. As we mentioned, we have a weaker institution and strong institution. And sometimes if in your consortium, all the members are at the same level, decentralization is something that you need to consider, as Joanna mentioned, because when delivering reporting, financial reporting, technical reporting, all the members will deliver. But when you have a consortium, a mixed consortium where you have strong and weaker institutions, and you are a lead, for example, you tend sometimes to have problem with weaker institutions, as I mentioned earlier. We have experienced that with 10-year consortium management. The first phase, we decentralized the management, but from the funder perspective, the lead were not performing because the reports were not coming, technical, financial reports were not coming and did not comply with the regulation. So we have to decide at the end to say, okay, we want to keep those weaker institutions in the network, but the financial component need to be centralized. And it has a consequence of the loss of exchange rate and transfer of funding. So now we have to choose, what do we want? Building the capacity of weaker institutions to better manage, or just still keep centralizing the management of finance and leaving only research. Both are going together. How to do research and how to manage funds.
Thank you, Bassero. Nadia, thoughts?
Yes, so I mean, I agree with what Joe and Bas have already said, and would go and say that it also depends on the situation. But I tend to lean towards decentralizing, depending on the purpose of the collaboration. And if you, first of all, if you look at the principles that we've been talking about when it comes to collaboration, a lot of them actually are operationalized in the decentralized operation. So you're looking at trust and respect. So at a point, you need to give a certain level of trust to, even if it's a weaker partner, to be able to handle some part of the management. You are talking about equity and inclusivity. And we mentioned these, but that is how it's actually operationalized, that you give a portion or a component of, and you can, those components can be varied, but you give a component of the program to each partner to manage. And we cannot overemphasize the reward of capacity strengthening that happens when partners manage part of the programs. And irrespective, in some of the work that I've done, some of the partners have said that what we are managing is not even about the amount of funds. It's not a lot of funds, but just the processes that we go through to be able to manage that has taught us so much. And we built both individual and institutional capacities to be able to do that, and now go ahead to manage, bigger funds. So we cannot overemphasize that benefit that it comes with it. So that's where I would lead.
Really good points. And Cara?
I'm going to argue with the premise. I think it's a false dichotomy, because some things are just more efficiently done centrally, and and that nobody really wants the burden of them. But most things are best shared and distributed. So that, and I like Nadia's idea that that everyone has a role to play, and that it's really important to then to support that role where institutions are developing capacities. But if responsibility is always given to those who have all the capacity to do it, there's no possibility for transformation of learning.
Okay, thank you. At this point, let me hand back to Lucy to perhaps close out the panel. And yeah, thank you all.
Thanks so much, Justin. And I'll be handing over to Sassy, so it's a rapid fire handover. I just wanted to thank everybody. We didn't get to a question about trust and how you build trust, and we didn't get to a question about how do you have fun? Because in my experience, collaborations are great fun, and we shouldn't forget that. But thank you to you all, and I'm handing over to Sassy. Thanks so much.
Hello. Oh, finally, I've managed to get back. Thank you so much to everybody for such a rich set of presentations and discussions. It will take such a long time to go through all of those comments and reflect further and try to pull them together into some kind of shared output for all of us. But I'm going to give a quick attempt to try to just cover some of the main points that have come out, at least to me. I'm going to try and share a screen here and bring together a couple of slides. Can you all see those slides?
Yep, they look great.
Great, thank you. So I think we began the session and Nadia helpfully gave us a framework of the different principles that might be essential to consider in managing collaborations. And there are many different high-level principles there, and we could add others, and they've come up really in the discussion, including the co-construction of knowledge that's so essential to well-functioning collaborations. But I think part of the real challenge comes in actually operationalizing some of these challenges in context of real complexity, in terms of the types of problems that are being explored, in terms of the nature of health systems, institutional arrangements, different actors, different disciplines, different types of knowledge. And we've heard about, through the chat, but also through the presentations, many different kinds of challenges in this operationalizing. And I'm just highlighting a few that have come up a lot. So balancing individual partner and institution interests, especially in the context of north-south power inequities and relationships. Trying to balance distributed leadership, shared leadership across many different actors and achieving the goals that funders require. So being both nimble but also inclusive. Those funding, or resource types of constraints that come from funders, restrictions on what resources can be used for. They might not necessarily reflect different partner priorities. Managing demands from funders, for example, on reporting and on types of outputs, which might not match with partner priorities as they unfold over time, and the creativity and new ideas that unfold over the course of collaborations. So I think what we see is, although there is a tendency to think about collaborations as kind of smooth, well-oiled machines, often what they look like, and this picture was once shared many years ago by Professor Mike Parker, and I still think of it often, they actually look often more like complex contraptions of some form, bringing together all kinds of different communities, stakeholders, interests, requiring a huge range of different forms and types of communication that are ethically challenging to manage. So we've heard a whole series of top tips and strategies, given all of these challenges of managing these contraptions. And the more immediate ones that came up, at least in my notes, were thinking about agreeing, tracking and reviewing shared values, goals, ways of working, right from the outset, coming back and redoing that time and time again through collaborations. Developing inclusive governance structures that support power sharing and sharing of responsibility and equity And there are many strategies that have been shared through this session there. Making sure that there's effective communication and systems of dialogue, both formal and informal, making sure that there's space and time for this, and all the MOUs and so on that underpin that. And making sure that capacity building is embedded throughout activities, including in management and building of institutional capacity for management itself. We had that useful framework from Cara helping us to think that we need to be paying attention to both the hardware and the software of managing collaborations. And Bas, you referred to the need for more evidence being needed on how we can manage collaborations and making sure that we are doing more transdisciplinary, translational and transformative research. We then went on in the discussion session to really talk about some more fundamental transformative areas, thinking about what are the kind of funding requirements and ways of priority setting that can start to transform how things are working. And we've had some nice examples. We have to really rethink who drives questions, who provides and holds funds, how is funding or contribution even defined? And we talked about how essential it is that funders invest in institutional core costs and governance structures, as well as in the software that's so crucial but often neglected, and that allows local innovation flexibility over time. We talked about new ways of doing business in an unequal world, looking at really who has control and how accountability mechanisms work to make sure that control is handed over to the South in helpful ways where that's required. There was a really useful discussion about who's in the circle. How can the circle be widened so it's not the same old players in the circle? How do funders help to do this in their requirements? How do Northern institutions support, for example, bridging institutions beginning to work with different networks, with different people, expanding out that circle? And there was a really valuable conversation about funders and all of us embracing risks, allowing us to make sure that we get engaged in activities and in networks where there will be challenges, where there might be some less strong actors, but who can contribute in different ways, and where capacity is required and demanded, where the knowledge is demanded. How can it be required that we take on these risks? And how can we support embracing these risks and being brave in the way that we define, measure and show off success? And thinking about what's the baseline when we measure success? Thanks for that comment, Nadia. It shouldn't just be judged on where we get to, but where we've come from. So overall, we're seeing that capacity building takes time. That needs to be recognized and built into funding mechanisms and ways of working. There needs to be continued balancing of power across many different players and disciplines. And there might be and should be an opportunity to rethink the way mentorship relationships are structured. So I think, Kari, you had some nice suggestions on this towards the end. We began to share resources for collaboration management, and it's been quite hard to keep track of all the ideas and inputs coming up through this session. But we'll trawl back through and gather all of these, and we'd love to hear more resources that we could share with you all and with ourselves. But we had a number that were referred to in Prof. Basiru's presentation, and we've gathered and will continue to gather others in the lead up to and post this session. So I just wanted to finish off by saying a huge thank you to all the panel members. As Justin said, we really demanded a lot of you in that last session, especially, as well as presentations. Thank you so much to everybody for actively listening and contributing through the group chat. We'd love to continue to hear more, and we will work towards a shared output where we bring together some of these thoughts and ideas and put them onto the HSG website. If you do have more that you'd like to share that you weren't able to raise in the chat box, please do email these to Nadia, who will support us all in gathering them together and make sure that they get fed into the output that we develop. So a huge thank you to you all, and good night, good morning, and whatever else greeting is relevant at this point of the day. So goodbye and thank you to you all.
Bye.
Just wondering, oh, okay, can start. Everybody, okay. It looks like the whole
Hi, Bas. I think that we're trying to get the management group to help us take a photograph.
yeah, every time I try to get myself,
You get
I get really